My name is Sam Feltham and welcome to Expert Interviews here on Smash the Fat. For you today, we have sports scientist and holistic nutrition practitioner, Ben Pratt. How's it going, Ben?
Hi, Sam. How are you doing? I'm excited to be with you today.
It's fantastic to have you here because I was introduced to you really at a conference a couple of weekends ago called Health Unplugged, and your talk on kind of whitewashed foods, which we'll get into in a little bit, from your book Nutrition's Playground, which is a fantastic book that kind of encapsulates 10 steps on a health slide, so to speak, that we'll be going through today, and kind of researching more about you. You find out all this stuff, not just the book, that you're a chapter leader of the Weston Price Foundation here in the UK, as well as the founder of naturalfoodfinder.co.uk, which kind of helps put people in touch with natural food, hence the name. As well as as a suspension training book or manual, really, which is absolutely fantastic. Something that I use kind of pretty much in every workout as a suspension trainer. So that's very, very useful. But before we kind of get into today's subject, which is nutrition's playground, and it certainly is a bit of a playground at the moment, how exactly did you get into the position that you're in today?
Well, I guess my background goes back sort of 20 years in the sort of health field. I began straight out of school as a fitness instructor at a private club in London, and that got me on the path that I'm in now. I enjoyed that world of health and fitness and continued to progress and did my sports science degree and continued to work as a personal trainer for many years. Then gradually moved up into the space where I was actually teaching people to become personal trainers, which was a really enjoyable place to be, and I spent more than a decade doing that. But in so doing, that obviously created the need to understand more than you perhaps would when you're just talking with members of the general public, because here we have people who are willing to learn, who want to understand and really get into the meat behind sort of health and fitness, and that included nutrition. And about 10, 12 years ago, I really began to ask questions about the nutrition that we were advised from the government, because I was eating that way as a fitness consultant, but found myself not really able to cope with my weight. I was watching my weight pile on and not feeling so healthy, and I began to ask questions of that, and was fortunate enough to come across the work of Dr. Weston Price, and that opened up a whole new world for me, and has taken me a long way down that path to where I am today. But as I was teaching, I also had many students ask me questions about where they could actually find the nutrient-dense foods that I was teaching them about. And that took me down the route of setting up the website you mentioned, Natural Food Finder, and writing the book, Nutrition's Playground, to help people beyond just those that I could come into contact with face-to-face. And that kind of has brought me to the path where I am now, as a qualified holistic nutrition practitioner, and somebody who has had 2 decades working in the health fitness industry. Fantastic.
Now, Nutrition's Playground is available on Amazon, so folks can go buy it if they want. If you're in the UK, go to smashthefat.com/NPUK. That'll take you straight through to the Amazon page. And if you're in the US, go to smashthefat.com/NPUS. And that again will take you straight through to the Amazon page and help support the show, which I think is important too. Yeah, I'd like to think so. But getting into the book itself, now, as I mentioned kind of at the beginning, you're framing Nutrition's Playground as though it's a playground slide. So you've got 10 steps going up towards the top of the slide, so that then you can kind of look out onto the rest of the playground. And you start off with short-sighted convenience. So what is the short-sighted convenience that we've ended up in?
Yeah, it's a bit of a tongue twister, that one.
Yes.
I think today, just if we're looking specifically at food and the world of food, Most of our lives are now driven by other things, and food is something that is a convenience to us rather than it being a central part of our lives. There are studies that have shown that the percentage of money that we spend today on food is considerably less than it was just a couple of generations ago. It's less than 10% of our annual income is typically spent on food because it has less importance in our lives. Yet when you look at the amount of money, for example, that people spend on electrical gadgets or those sorts of technologies today, it's considerably more. Whereas 2 generations ago, those things hardly took up any of our spend. So what we've done in modern society is we have reprioritized where our financial spend goes, with much less of it now being placed on food. Now, fortunately, the industrial food industry has made that even easier because they've produced huge amounts of highly processed foods that are exceptionally cheap. They've made it possible to eat and give yourself the energy you need with very, very cheap foods. Unfortunately, though, why that convenience factor is short-sighted is because those foods are typically very nutritionally devoid, and therefore over time they begin to build up until our health starts to fall apart at the seams because we've relied on the convenience factor rather than on the nutritional factor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Now you kind of move on from there to look at traditional human health, and Weston A. Price is probably the first person that you should go to in terms of traditional human health, because he wrote an absolutely amazing book. And off the top of my head, is it Physical Degeneration and Nutrition, or is it Nutrition and Physical Degeneration?
Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, that's the one.
There we go, that's the one. Either one kind of works. But anyway, so he wrote this book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And it kind of, has inspired so many people, Sally Fallon probably being the primary one setting up the Weston A. Price Foundation itself. It's an incredible study and book that he did. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was first introduced to the work of Dr. Weston Price, I think it was back in 2003 when I was reading a book by a man called Bill Walcott. And in his book, he talked about Weston Price's work. For those who don't know, he essentially was a dentist. He was a very well-recognized dentist, and back in the 30s, he helped set up what was to become the American Dental Association. He had 60 scientists underneath him who worked with him. So he was a man of no small standing. But he decided to give up his practice in Cleveland and to travel the world over a period of 10 years, visiting cultures that he'd heard stories of who apparently had great dental health. Now, he himself had witnessed as a dentist, the increasing rates of dental caries, and he was keen to find out, what was it that made these traditional cultures or these isolated cultures immune to dental caries. And so that was his motivation. That's what he went out and did. And for me personally, reading his work, it's not an easy book to read. His writing style is quite hard.
Yeah, it was 1930, I think, that he wrote it, was it?
It was, yeah. It was 1940s probably when the book was published, but yeah, it was. His writing style is difficult, and it's a lengthy Bible. He wrote it in a very scientific manner, so if you can endure the 500 pages, there's a lot to learn there. And I did read that, and it really stuck out to me, particularly because he identified cultures where I'd lived amongst. So I'd lived in Scotland for a few years, and he talked about the islanders in the Scottish Hebrides, but he'd also talked about some of the Fiji Islanders in the South Pacific, and I was fortunate enough in my teenage years to live there. And so it really related to me as he talked about cultures and their traditions, and I was able to identify some of those in the places where I had lived as well. But perhaps the biggest message that comes out of his work was that it was the processed, devitalized foods that he identified as each of these cultures began to come into contact with Western civilization, as they began to utilize sugar and refined white flour, as they began to utilize vegetable oil instead of traditional fats. As these foods came into their societies, he noticed that disease began to creep in and chronic health problems began to appear. And it wasn't just this observation, but he also then took people from those societies who had lost their health with the contact of the Western world, and he put them back into the food environment that they came from, where they began to eat their traditional foods again, and he observed that their health problems began to go away. So that really fascinated him. And although he was a dentist, he used his scientists back in the States, and he would send them food samples from the countries he visited, and he asked them to test the foods for nutrient value. And he began to observe trends in nutritional value, in particular that certain fat-soluble vitamins, vitamins A, D, E, and K, and also certain minerals were considerably higher in the traditional foods compared to the processed foods that were becoming common at the time. And no matter what food these cultures ate, and they varied considerably from very high-fat, low-carb meals all the way down to the other end of the spectrum with moderate fats at 30% and much higher carbohydrate intakes, providing these societies were eating their traditional foods, they tended to get these high levels of nutrition. Over years of perhaps trial and error, these cultures had learned to identify what foods made them healthy and gave them healthy children. And as long as they ate that way, they got healthy. Now, in our society, we've lost that. It's got to the point now where we're not eating for health. Too often we select our foods out of taste preference. And that's where the food industry plays with us a lot, hence the title, Nutrition's Playground. They're messing around with us so that they can make money and get rich. But unfortunately, that comes at the expense of our health because we're eating foods that are lacking in nutrition.
Wow. And this has kind of led to a widespread whitewash foods as well, and that's what you were talking about at Health Unplugged. So tell us about this widespread whitewash.
Well, I identified 4 foods in particular that I think have become prevalent in our food culture. In particular, white flour, particularly flour that comes from wheat, although these days there's many other options that are highly refined flours. But wheat was the prevalent one that we built our societies on in modern day. I identified highly refined sugar, processed salt, and then also the pasteurization, homogenization, and standardization of milk. So those things in particular have become very, very prevalent as common foods that we live, eat, and use on a regular basis today. Just to give you an indication of the sorts of figures, in the UK, on average today, we consume somewhere in the region of 70 to 75 kilos of white flour products per person per year. With sugar, it's up as high, for adults, as high as 49 kilos of sugar per person per year. That includes not just the crystalline sugar, but also any syrups or sweeteners that are found in processed foods. And with regards to milk, milk is still one of the most prevalent foods in the UK. I don't have figures to hand as to how much people consume, but it's in the national food surveys, it's very, very high on the regular food consumption. And one of the things that attest to that was that when back in the early 80s, the food guidelines shifted to say we had to eat a low-fat diet, the foods that the national guidance targeted was to cut back on dairy, because we were eating so much dairy in the UK that it was where one of our highest amounts of dietary fat was coming from. So that's a good indicator that we were consuming a lot, because they wanted to target dairy as the way to get fat intake down.
Absolutely. I mean, over the past 40 years, it's led to this massively fat phobia that people have had, like in the media and even at home. So why exactly did this fat phobia come to be, and are we wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the fat phobia, I think, has come in as a result of probably 40, maybe 50 years of both scientific and political dogma. It harks back, and I'm sure people have heard the story many times, of a scientist called Ancel Keys. Now, Ancel Keys, he just made an observational correlation back in the 50s. He observed that certain countries with an increasing intake of fat seemed to have some increasing correlation to heart disease. However, at the time, that, as you well document in your own book, Sam, that didn't really bear enough strength for the scientific community to come on board. He got quite a lot of criticism from that study in the 50s. But Keys, being the kind of person he was very dogmatic and made it his mission to go out and prove his theory. And he went out and he produced another study, which was done much more rigorously and published in the 70s. And in that study, he was able to make a stronger correlation and show stronger evidence. And in conjunction with some other people, people like Mark Hedstedt from Harvard University, and also a good senator in the US who decided to set up national guidelines in the US. They were able to bring across this high or low fat message, because if we take fat out of the diet, we have to replace it with something else, and that became agricultural commodities, in particular those that were being subsidized in the US at the time, i.e. wheat and corn and soya, those big foods that were being grown en masse to help farmers make money and to help support the economy. And the guidelines that came out in the 1980s in the US supported that position. It supported the use of lots of carbohydrates and lots of grains. It cut back on fat, because at the time, the best guess of the evidence was that a low-fat diet would be better for heart disease. Now, in the UK, it took us till 1984 to accept those guidelines, which we did, and we shifted our position from one of more moderate fat to a lower fat intake. And we have continued to hang on to that guideline right through to this day. Our national advice still tells us that we should eat fewer than 35% of our calories from dietary fat, and that we should have less than 10% of our calories from saturated fat. Now that's an interesting position to be in, because in the US, they've since changed their guidelines. Back in 2005, when they reviewed their food guidelines, they chose to remove the upper limit on saturated fat, because the evidence had been building to show that saturated fat was no longer the #1 target. And so they've taken that guideline away, and they've also taken away the upper limit on total fats, which they had a tighter guideline of 30%, and now they don't put one. Because total fat intake just is not related to heart disease whatsoever. But after 30, 40 years of this message being shared again and again and again in the public domain, it's quite clear that that message has filtered through to the public. And a walk through any supermarket very quickly shows you which products are being sold as healthy. It's the ones identified as low fat. Yet the science has become much more neutral on that ground. And it's very, very hard to really stand there with a true scientific hat on and say that total fat is linked to heart disease, because it's just not. And the guidance on saturated fat now is considerably shakier than it was in the past. And at best, you could probably say that saturated fat is neutral in relation to heart disease. Certainly, there are some fats that have been implicated. And since '92, we've been well aware that trans fatty acids, which are created in the formation of margarines and other hydrogenated fats used in processed foods, there's a pretty strong body of evidence now to suggest that those man-made fats are problematic in heart disease. So we live in this kind of strange world where we're encouraged to miss saturated fats in our diet and to eat lots of oils, particularly plant-based oils, and that those things are indeed healthy for us. I believe that there are other vested interests that have brought about that big shift. Even heart-healthy olive oil, there's some interesting stories behind how that's become the dominant oil of today, and how much money, time, and investment the olive oil industry invested in what's the polite way to say this, in bringing the scientific community on board with their message. And indeed today, many people think olive oil is the oil of health. It certainly can form part of a good diet, but I don't think we should be exclusively eating olive oil. So I think we're stuck here in this place where, many people have heard that message for so long, it's kind of hard to switch off from this idea that fat is bad for us, particularly saturated fat is bad for us, even though the evidence has been building for the last decade that it is not necessarily correct.
And it's very, very interesting, particularly here in the UK, as you were saying, because the position of the NHS, British Dietetics Association, is very kind of fixed at the moment, certainly. And kind of my experience, there isn't much in the way of any movement whatsoever, even though there's been movement in the States based on the evidence, even if it's kind of minimal movement in the US. Yeah. Kind of here in the UK, there's literally been no movement on the Eat Well plate at all.
Yeah. Have you seen the latest change in the US, the one that happened in the 2015 guidelines of removing cholesterol as an issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's no longer a nutrient of concern or something like that, isn't it?
But the interesting thing for me there is, whilst that advice existed essentially for 35 years in their guidelines, there's been no apology. There's been no, sorry, we got it wrong, guys. We messed up and we told you cholesterol was bad for us in our diet, and actually it's not. And the bizarre thing was, as much as Ansel Keys gets shot down, if you go back 20 years before Keys to a couple called Warren and Sperry, who did some studies, they found even way back then that dietary cholesterol had no bearing on blood cholesterol levels, because our bodies create most of our cholesterol, and more than 80% of the cholesterol is made in the liver, and every cell in the human body has the ability to produce cholesterol. So if our cholesterol levels are high, surely it's got more to do with what factors are controlling cholesterol production than it does to do with dietary cholesterol. So eat your eggs. It's all good.
Absolutely. And kind of that's something that probably both of us have to battle almost on a daily basis. When you have somebody that's new to these ideas and you say, just have eggs at breakfast, that's absolutely every single day almost, that's absolutely fine. Don't worry, have an egg a day at least. And they're like, oh my gosh, I can't, otherwise my heart's going to pop.
Yeah, agreed. There was a great study, I don't know if you came across it, it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and I can't remember which university it came out of. It was either Portsmouth or Southampton, and they studied the whole issue on eggs, and they looked at people who were sticking to the guidelines, eating no more than 2 eggs a week, and they then had other people who ate 2 eggs a day. So we had people eating 14 eggs a week versus the other group eating 2 eggs a week, and they tracked their cholesterol right from the start all the way through the study. I think it was 16 weeks long, and at the end of the study, the people eating 14 eggs a week had better cholesterol scores and had seen much greater improvement than those who were only eating 2 eggs a week. So they quite clearly concluded in saying that dietary cholesterol in eggs was clearly not related to the end result of high cholesterol in the blood, and actually even supported the idea that regular cholesterol consumption from eggs had a better bearing on dietary cholesterol. So, there's a pretty good example of some research that suggested the opposite.
Yeah, and within this country, again, there's no movement there, which is rather frustrating. And that just kind of shows that in this nutrition playground that there are many myths and misconceptions. Now, are there any other myths or misconceptions that you'd like to add to kind of the dietary fat and cholesterol debacle?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. You're referring to the chapter in my book that talks about this, and I think I picked on a number of things that I feel are myths in relation to diet. One of them that I talk about in there is in relation to soy consumption, and for some time, soy has been identified as a health food, and that came probably originally from the China study by T. Colin Campbell, where he investigated various populations all around China, looked at their dietary habits and patterns, and tried to identify that because they had such low rates of heart health, that their dietary habits and patterns were therefore linked. And this sort of idea, well, what do the Chinese eat? And soy comes up as one of their staple foods, and then that sort of translated over to, well, everyone should eat tofu and drink soy milk because that's a healthier option. It's low in saturated fat. It's good for your heart. And look at the Chinese history. They're very, very healthy. Unfortunately, there's some things that are missed in that oversimplification of that message. I'm not saying, if I just clarify, I'm not saying T. Colin Campbell simplified the message, but the way it's been interpreted has led to a simplified message. His message wasn't quite so simple. Now, if we look at the Chinese diet, it's quite varied, and it varies in the cities versus in the country. And soy was never eaten as a staple food. It didn't replace all meat consumption. There's a lot of pork consumption in inland China. There is quite a bit of fish consumption in coastal China. Those factors cannot be ignored. Yes, soy got eaten, but it also was prepared in entirely different ways to industrially produced soy tofu or soy milk. Soy sauce, for example, was fermented for probably 2 or more years before it was ever consumed. Tofu is a slowly prepared and fermented food. But when these foods are produced on an industrial level, they're prepared very quickly in most cases. There are some companies who still slow brew their soy sauce, but in most cases, a lot of those soy foods are produced very, very quickly. And unfortunately, that leaves them in a different nutritional place to when they are slowly prepared and fermented as they were traditionally in China. And Also, when we look at them as they were only foods that were eaten like as a side dish or as a condiment, you'd have a little bit of tofu on the side. It wasn't the meal. It didn't replace your meat as you made some kind of tofu burger. And when you eat those things, they're very, very high in certain anti-nutrients, but they're also very high in something called an isoflavin, which is a phytoestrogen, an estrogen mimicker. So, and there's a lot of problems associated with excess estrogen, and soy isoflavins in particular have been seen to be quite potent, perhaps some of the strongest estrogen disruptors that are present in our food. Now, that shouldn't be the only thing that we should avoid if we're worried about estrogen excess in relation to our health. There's many, many other things that we could look at, but that was one of the things I sort of highlighted, that soy itself, it shouldn't really be heralded as this great health food that's going to return our health. It's a factor amidst a myriad of factors that can contribute to health or ill health, depending on how we get at it. And I think that's kind of the message of Nutrition's Playground. It's not specifically that this food is good and that food is bad. It's very, very easy to slip into that route.
Yeah, life isn't black and white, and neither is nutrition.
No, it definitely. Anything I've ever learned is it's never black and white. It's shades of grey. And I don't think there's many foods where you could clearly say without doubt that is a bad food. You should not eat that. But there are, levels of going, well, is milk a good food? Well, it can be. Yeah. Milk produced today, semi-skimmed, homogenized, processed milk, probably not the best. There are better ways of consuming dairy. Is white flour good food? Not really. It has some nutritional value. We can't ignore that. There's minerals and there's some vitamins in there, but it's not the best way to eat it. And if you're eating huge doses of it, as we are today, it's going to contribute to ill health. But if it's eaten in smaller amounts and it's prepared well from good quality grain that we start with, it can contribute in some way to good health. And I would say the same thing with something like soy. It can play a part in our diet, but again, it should be prepared properly and it should be eaten from nutritionally rich sources, and it should not necessarily replace other foods. It should play a small part in what should be a varied and healthful diet.
And I think one of the main messages as well is that quality counts.
Oh, absolutely.
That's probably the most important factor within your diet is the quality. So kind of on that note, what should people be doing when it comes to diet and quality?
And I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there. If we're not in ill health, so we don't have a chronic health problem, then the quality of the food that we eat is paramount, because that should be the primary driver of our health. It should be the food that we eat. And where we can afford to invest more in the quality of our food, then we should do so. Now, there's something worth considering here, and that's in studies where they've looked at food quality and they looked at the way the general public have interpreted food quality, what they've actually found is that it tends to be a bigger shift towards brand quality, not necessarily nutrient quality. So, if you're buying the cheapest chips basics brand, and then we say, I'm going to go and buy a quality food, to then go and buy a high-end branded microwave meal is not necessarily any better. And there's been quite a few programs on that. I think Horizon focused on that, where they showed that the quality of the food was not actually much better. I'm not talking about the brand quality. I'm talking about the nutrient quality of the food. And that really starts to lead us away from the world of industrial produced processed food and gets us back to cooking from scratch, using basic natural ingredients that were dug out of the ground, were picked off a tree, that were fished, that were naturally farmed and reared in open outdoor access land, things like that. Getting back to real food ingredients and trying to eat them as fresh and as natural as possible. Where we may find that someone has a health problem, perhaps they've been eating in a way that caused their health to deteriorate over time, we may find that, for example, there could be problems already with their digestion. And whilst moving to a real food diet will certainly help, if their digestion's too compromised, it may actually require a bit more of a targeted approach to help their digestion resolve. And this is where sometimes the world of supplementation and the world of holistic health can really help and restore that person's digestive health, so that the real food they're eating isn't going to waste. It's getting utilized because they can absorb it and digest it. So there is still space sometimes for targeted therapies, but that usually is related to ill health. When we have reasonable health, then it's got to start with the basis of real food nutrition.
Excellent. So just so the listeners can kind of get an overview, for instance, what is kind of your daily, weekly diet look like?
Cool. It's varied a lot over the years. I mean, I'm an example of somebody where I have some chronic health problems. I have a gluten intolerance, I have a gluten sensitivity, and when I eat things that are produced with wheat or have any wheat content in it, then that negatively affects my digestive system. And so my diet's already a little bit, steered differently because I have to avoid all wheat products for health reasons. That's been ongoing probably for 7 years now, and I've tested myself at occasional intervals to see if that has eased, and it's better than it was, but it's still there, and it's something that I have to avoid. So that actually makes it quite easy to eat a lower carbohydrate style of diet. I'm not a ketogenic advocate necessarily. I'm not a low carby type person, but just by the fact that I just avoid most wheat products, that immediately takes a big chunk of that high carb intake out of my diet. So I would typically say, whilst percentages are going to vary from day to day, I probably eat somewhere in the region of about 40% carbohydrates, 40% fat, and about 20% protein. That's where I've tested myself several times, and that's around about that level seems to be where I sit comfortably.
Excellent.
I tend to find if my carbohydrates get too low, I feel a bit of fatigue with that, or if my fat intake gets too high, the same thing occurs. But I used to be in a much higher fat, lower carb place, and I could function well, but I've had to adapt as my health has changed. But foods that I would eat generally will have one properly home cooked from scratch meal each day. That's usually what I do. I tend to find that I don't necessarily need to eat that often. Some people, you tend to, they talk about this. I need 3 meals and 2 snacks every day. That just doesn't really work for me. I'm usually not hungry till about 10, and then I'll have usually something like a natural yogurt, some fruit, nuts, coconut, things like that, all mixed together for breakfast. Again, lunch might be a bit later in the day, maybe somewhere around about 2, and that would probably tend to have something that's a little bit higher in protein and fat in it. I may draw on a sourdough gluten-free bread, or I may lean towards something like an egg type omelette with lots of vegetables and things inside. And then as I get to my main meal, then that usually will have some sort of substantial meat source in it. And with some vegetables or whatever. A lot of the food I eat probably looks similar to what other people eat, but I would have a chili con carne quite happily. But the quality of the ingredients that I start with, that's what matters to me. And I want to get good quality meats from organic free-range animals, and I want to use lots of veg in there, so it's not a meat-heavy dish. It's a chili with lots of veg and legumes and beans in there. So all of those things matter to me. It's about having real food and real ingredients, and ensuring that those things will sustain me and keep me satisfied.
Fantastic, and I think that's a good place to end, unfortunately, Ben. But for folks at home, you can find Ben's book, Nutrition's Playground, as I said at the beginning, on Amazon. If you're in the UK, go to smashthefat.com/NPUK. In the US, smashthefat.com/NPUS. That'll take you straight through to Amazon and help support the show as well. Now, were there any other wise words that you want to give us before you have to go, Ben?
Perhaps just to tie on to something we've just said there, was that understanding all the ins and outs of what makes good quality food can be complicated, and we could probably spend 2 hours just talking about that and going through individual food groups. But to simplify, that's what Natural Food Finder, the website, was all about. And I list 14 different categories, and within that identify what foods should be avoided, what is good, what's better, and then what are the best foods to go for. And so something that really helps if you're feeling at a disconnect with this message is to go to the site, look at a certain food group. Say you're looking at grains, or say you're looking at milk, or you're looking at coconut products. You could go to that site, and then you look at, well, where am I in the rating system? Am I eating in the avoid section? Well, can I move up one level, get to the good level until that feels normal? And it just helps gradually draw people from eating processed foods up the spectrum towards eating the best foods. Because sometimes it's just too big a jump to make, and it's too difficult to shift just because you've heard a message shared by somebody like myself. And so I'd really encourage people to have a look at that site and to help themselves understand how they might guide their food quality gradually in the right direction.
Fantastic. And people can check out that website at naturalfoodfinder.co.uk. Also, I believe you guys are on Twitter under natural_food.
Yeah, that's correct. Or the one I probably frequent more often on Twitter is Ben_Pratt. That's the one I tend to tweet from most.
Excellent. So people can follow you there. And that leaves us just one more thing to do before you do have to go, Ben, and that's to hear a smash it out from Ben Pratt. So on the count of 3, I want you to shout smash it out to the camera. So 1, 2, 3.
Smash it out.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Thank you so much for your time today, Ben. It's greatly appreciated. Folks, go check out Ben's website, naturalfoodfinder.co.uk. You can find him on Facebook under Natural Food Finder UK, as well as I just mentioned on Twitter, Ben_Pratt with 2 T's, and then natural_food as well on Twitter. Again, thank you so much for your time today, Ben, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks very much, Sam. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.